Hi, this is Paul. I really like when Ross Douthat and Ezra Klein talk because they're clearly friends. They clearly have different, they're addressing the political social landscape from different directions. They clearly respect each other. They're clearly open to each other. They clearly learn from each other. And when this dropped, I knew they would be talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination and what that means. And this conversation did not disappoint.
It connects to something that I do think, which is that there is a problem of pessimism and despair, from my perspective, on the American left right now that hasn't been there to the same extent for most of my life and career. So I'm wondering if you see it that way, if you see a lot of progressive despair out there.
I think that there has been a kind of evaporation of a bright horizon in liberal thought, in a lot of left thought. I think that it has become about averting different kinds of calamities.
Mm-hmm.
So the calamity of fascism, the calamity of a return to white supremacy or re-strengthening of it, the calamity of climate change, the calamity of oligarchy. And instead it's been about how much of how bad it will be we can avert. I don't think that's the right way to look at the future, but I think there is something to that. But I guess because I get to be on the podcast with you, don't you think this is a bit of a both sides thing? I have been really struck by how much the right also turned backwards in this time. I mean, like all the way back to antiquity, right? Bronze Age pervert and a rediscovery of Sparta.
We have to return to the steppe warriors. Yes, absolutely.
There's been something where it feels like our politics.
Part of why this caught my attention was I woke up this morning and was pondering the video that I made about the unchurched Pleasant Valley Sunday and the apocalypse upon it. And then I wrote a Twitter thread because I wanted to get those down. And I wrote a piece on CRC Voices. Now, don't feel bad, Michael Sartori. I have been on CRC Voices for the better part of at least 25 years, probably close to 27 years. And I wrote this piece and I sort of poured my heart into it. And nobody responded, so don't feel so bad. That happens sometimes. I called it Two Kinds of Conservative Radicals at War Among Us, following on the Kids Are All Right piece that I made, the video that I released this morning. That'll be yesterday for when this one comes out. The kids are all right. Following the matrix of postmodern consensus institutions and assumptions is a sort of conservatism with respect to the institutions greatly shaped by the managerial victory of the Second World War. You know, part of when you read this book about the war in the Pacific, one of the ways that the United States was able to crush the Japanese was just simply logistics. And Spruance emphasized that. What we were able to do, and this is true of the American Civil War too, in terms of how the North had victory over the South, the United States was just able to deploy more soldiers, more battleships, more tanks, more aircraft, more, and they had superior logistical handling. They could build runways quicker on those little islands, and it was just a steamroller. And it was so interesting because, of course, the Japanese thought, well, we're going to win because we have fighting spirit, and just the weight of American managerialism just roared through and just completely crushed the Japanese. Public schools and institutions mostly championed by the democratic tradition founded by FDR. It's really interesting reading. There's some real interesting similarities. This is going to trigger some of you between FDR and Trump. How their contempt for the press, their charisma. There's some real differences, obviously, too. But reading FDR and his later years during the war, there's some real Trumpish things going on there, or back and forth. They continue to move along the liberationist vectors of the progressive movement along the lines of sex and race. Use government law and money to centrally liberate and fund the continuation of this project. It's an imperial movement that wishes to push these values into the rest of the world and counter movements that stand against it in the tradition of the Second World War and the Cold War. It sees itself as revolutionary and radical, but it's been around so long and has captured and centered so many institutions, it really is a conservative movement to stay the course in terms of the victories won over the last 75 years. And it's that way, and Joey made this point years ago. So many people are just trying to conserve what was won in the Second World War or the counterculture afterwards. And I saw that, I've just been seeing that in the Christian Reformed Church so often. The opposing movement sees itself as conservative, but is looking for something quite a bit more medieval, but also close in terms of the location of defining institutions. Trust in institutions that has been designed to bear the revolutionary load is lost. They only trust institutions they have a degree of control over, and they are deeply pessimistic about the larger ones: traditional marriage, traditional liturgy, homeschooling, great books, classical education. The digital is medieval. Cut the cord, stop the slop, take away the screens from the kids, elect a chaos monster, and the more we can destroy the government institutions, the better, to David Brooks' great horror. In my Twitter thread, I wrote that it struck me that in many ways, for those with affluent structure, status, and privilege, and attained sobriety, the post-war consensus has reached its eschaton. No fear of hell, only anxiety over people with red hats and the climate apocalypse. When Rod Dreher at Midwestuary was at Midwestuary, he kept talking about how the young, or at least a portion of them, probably not those in the kids are all right camp, have zero trust in the institutions left to them by the builders and boomers. They don't believe government will save them. They don't have confidence in their parents' marriages or any other marriage will survive, while there's a significant, likely religious community around to support it. They've opted out of public schools and will Benedict opt their way into their difficult futures. And of course, as McMo had said, and I played that clip in the Blood of Charlie Kirk video, that Charlie was a institution builder, and so in that sense he was sort of a moderate. He wasn't kind of a radical. If they're going to kill Kirk, they're simply not expecting any love from anyone associated with post-war institutions. They're on their own. They will gather their friends. They will seek community and communion. And so I think, let's see, both Douthit and Klein have a point. There's two kinds of conservatisms working here, and there are pessimisms on both sides.
Has cast its view backwards. And in some ways, I think the right has a version of this. It is, we lost touch with who we really are. And then the left has a version of this, which is, we've never fully accepted, repented, transcended who we really were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no question that there is a version of what you might call in internet lingo the black pill vision of the world on the right that has been very powerful in certain ways. I think it's been one of the key flaws of the Trump administration, and I've written this, I think, is that it is itself, even in power, sort of too pessimistic about its own situation. It's like, the hour is late, and if we don't defeat all of progressivism in the next 6 months, then the Republic is doomed.
Flight 93, it's going down.
Right. No, that has been a thread running through the right since, at the very least, since Donald Trump came down the escalator, if not going back to the crack-up of the George W. Bush presidency. I'm interested, though, in it on the left, in part, honestly, because I feel like I've been in rooms with liberals and had about 1,200 conversations over the last 10 or 15 years where I have to explain, why did the right get so dark? Mm-hmm. And so I do want to pin you down and ask you why you think the left got dark. But I also think, to me, as an observer, it feels like the pessimistic turn, you could say, well, of course, it starts when Donald Trump wins, right? And it starts when populism emerges. And there's truth to that. But I also kind of feel like it started a little bit before that there's a pessimistic turn starts, somewhere in 2013 or 2014 under Obama, that becomes what we call wokeness and so on. What do you...
psychological theory I have of my own side. I think that Obama felt to many people like some kind of climax of the liberal project. If in this country, 4 years removed from the flag pin election of 2004, we could elect a man named Barack Hussein Obama.
I think Ezra Klein is exactly right about this point.
A black man from Chicago. Then everything was possible. Now I think people, we take Obama so for granted, right? What that was so for granted. But it was incredibly unlikely seeming just a couple of years before it happened. Like, it seemed way out of the bounds of possibility. And we elected Obama, or Obama got elected. And it's not that nothing happened. It's that what happened, it disappointed people. Here you have, the most talented liberal politician of his generation wins a big victory and is actually able to succeed where his recent predecessors have failed on the single project that had united left for decades, which is passing a big healthcare bill. And even that felt disappointing. And after it did not solve America's race problem. It did not mean the end of systemic racism. It did not mean the end of police brutality. And it ends in Donald Trump. And I think that it sort of shatters liberal optimism. I think liberalism becomes exhausted and uncertain after that. What is its next project? The left, the thing that I would think of as more like the left of the liberals, right? The Bernie Sanders left. I think that has actually had real moments of incredible optimism. But I think liberalism, which is the sort of mainstream of the Democratic Party, it didn't have an idea after Obama. And the fact that, so first Hillary Clinton is sort of named, is seen as a successor, and she fails in the election quite catastrophically. And then Biden, he could not articulate what was going to be next. He was always what had come before. He was always a shadow.
And I think he's exactly right. And I think as doubt that's going to press him towards the end of the video, we'll probably go there. I'm not going to play the whole thing. But doubt that's going to press him and say, okay, well, give us a future. And they don't have one. And I think to turn it around, some of my pessimism is, well, if you look at the Ortho Bros, okay, let's make Constantinople great again. All right, the Trad Caths, well, let's make Rome great again. The Neo-Puritans, they're not quite as clear. They don't really look to Geneva as such. One of the things that I've been noting, following some of the Reformed things, dabbling into some of these corners of Dutch Calvinism that on some previous videos talked about. It's not Geneva. It's not New Haven, Connecticut. It's not Wenham, Massachusetts. But the conservatives, at least, despite the fact that I think they're not fully owning up to the challenges, and this is where I really want at some point talk more about the Japanese and the Second World War, because they're such an interesting example of a project where, hey, you know what? They captured the government. They had their emperor. They had, in the modern period, they had toyed with liberalism and then pushed it away as a culture, and they fully entered into lion culture, and they were going to make Japan great again. They had an eschatological religious vision, and it all came crumbling down. Part of the reason I really like that conversation that I played quite a bit of yesterday with Jordan Hall and Gray Hamilton was, I think Jordan quite well showed that war, don't get too distracted by the cannons and the ships and the tanks and the nukes and the bloodshed. War is finally fundamentally spiritual. And it's, even though everyone's paying attention to the European theater in the Second World War, I think in some ways the most interesting theater to look at on this score are the Japanese. Because for one, it's a happier story in some ways because, well, it ends better at least with Japan. But would we argue today that Japan is flourishing with their crushing depopulation curve? You know, there's all the hand-wringing about migrants in Europe. Well, Japan, they're an island. They're not letting the migrants on, unlike the other island, which is the UK. But they're just taking the elevator down in terms of their population. And, you know, what's like every week 2 more schools close in Japan, something like that. I mean, it's just so, yeah, cautionary tale 2. But this is this lack of a future. And again, I think the conservatives are correct in that, well, if you want to build a future, you've got to look to the past, because that's where you're going to learn what you need to build. But at the same time, we've got a lot that we're facing that doesn't necessarily easily map onto the past.
Of the thing that had gotten him to that place, which is the Obama coalition. And so now there's nothing. There's no recognized leader of liberalism. There's no singular project that unites liberalism. It's not universal health care now. I think for a while it was climate change. I mean, if you're thinking about existential levels of pessimism, and we're talking in the week, I think that people's minds are not now as much on, you know, if my inbox and my conversations are to judge climatic collapse as political collapse, and whether or not there will be an after to the Trump administration or a return to something that they feel as more normal.
Right.
If you're asking me to sort of give you the vibes.
I buy that. And I think you could frame it maybe the way you just did and say, look, liberals told the country and told themselves that the stakes of the 2024 election were absolute, right? That, you know, democracy is on the ballot. And after you lose an election like that, if you tell yourself it's existential and you lose, then it's not even clear how you return to sort of normal political alarm in that environment.
I think there's that. I think the loss of 2024 shattered the Democratic Party's confidence in its own politics. And I just don't think that the new leadership, the new ideas have yet emerged. I mean, one reason I think Abundance did as well as it did as a book, and it created so much energy, which was more than I thought it was going to create, is because it dropped into a void. Here's the way I am thinking about where the Democratic Party is right now. There is a debate between, on the policy side, a liberal vision of policymaking and a populist version of policymaking and power, right? Is the problem that the government isn't able to deliver and our capacity, the state capacity is weakened, or is the problem just that we have oligarchy and corporate power? And if you could smash that oligarchy and smash that corporate power, we'd be able to do all the things we promised people, right? Then there's a split on politics. And this is the one where we sort of jumped over, I think, a reckoning that's going to have to happen at some point. My gloss on what went wrong is 2 things. Liberalism became a political movement that didn't deliver. when you elected liberals in different places, Democrats in different places, they didn't deliver change in your life. The outcomes were not good enough, not under Biden, not in California under Gavin Newsom, or in, New York under Andrew Cuomo, or, in Illinois.
And I think this, when you look at this divide that I was writing about, the conservatives of the left, the radical/conservatives of the left that Klein is talking about, they believe in government. They look for government. They look for government to save them. And that's exactly the opposite on the other side, the conservative radicals on the right. They don't have any anticipation of government saving them. If government, basically part of the reason you elect Donald Trump is that so government won't do anything. So government won't, the government's probably going to get in the way. So if you have incompetent, inept government, that you have a government of no, well, that's good. You might as well have a government of no. And of course, it's been for years a policy to reduce the size of government. But you don't want government.
And I think this was actually more salient in terms of how much power got ceded to the right.
And that was, just to pause on that first point, and I think an interesting note that I think you would agree with, right, is that failure was obscured to some extent by the fact that the people who experienced that as failure moved away. Right. So it's not like liberalism seemed to fail in these states without losing power. Right. It's not like California is about to become Republican or New York State or Illinois. Right. It's just that.
And it's also especially interesting because part of what you're seeing, which I think is generally a negative thing, is, California is there's a concentration. People who are more red staters are moving out of California, and others are moving into California, because when you're looking at, let's say, the New York mayoral race that's gotten a lot of publicity, with a real socialist who wants to, wants to have the government run the supermarkets. Yeah.
People moved to other states. And so the problem became sort of invisible to Democratic leaders in those states who kept winning elections.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it was invisible to them, but nevertheless, I think your point that a lot of people who were failed worse by the growing unaffordability in these states were able to move away. But the other thing is that liberals became the people who didn't like you. That they became the people, and I've seen this a lot on the Abundance Tour and going on podcasts that, people now associate as sort of like the manosphere, and like the deep sense that liberals didn't like them. Liberals became censorious. They became the people who knew better than you. This became very toxic too. And the question of what is the political affect of the Democratic Party in a country where so many people support something that most people in the Democratic Party find genuinely intolerable, almost unimaginable to embrace, is a very unanswered question. And so I think that's also part of what you are noting. That there isn't a reigning political theory, because the political theory that people had kind of failed, but no new one and no new political leader emerged.
But I also think that there's a way in which I feel like it's gone beyond a bit what you describe, right? Where at sort of the peak of progressive cultural power, at that peak, there was a sense, progressives were censorious scolds who certainly didn't like populists and conservatives, but seemed to not like a lot of people generally. Today, I feel like it's almost, and these are, again, impressionistic, but it's almost like, do progressives like themselves? Right? Like,
you really want to put them on the couch.
Well, I'm.
But the answer is no.
The answer is no. Well, right. No, and in a way, that's always been true, right? Nothing like a self-hating liberal, right? But like, it's these things where, maybe people aren't really postponing kids because of climate change, maybe not. But progressives are having fewer kids. 30 years ago, progressives and conservatives in the Western world had the same birth rates. And today, they don't, right?
It's all about the birth rates.
34. No, I'm gonna add some other data points besides my perpetual hobby horses, right? But 30 or 40 years ago, maybe progressives, if you looked at sort of statistics on depression and anxiety and so on, yeah, maybe progressives looked a little more neurotic than conservatives. But today, maybe it's the smartphones, maybe it's something else, right? Today, progressives look a lot more anxious and depressed and neurotic, right? So there's this whole constellation of things that I just wonder I wonder two things. One, I wonder if even the attempt to sort of figure out a policy plan, right, is still not getting down to the bottom of what's amiss culturally in progressivism. But then also I wonder, again, since we're in a week when we're talking about radicalization and violence and so on, right, I worry about a kind of 1970s scenario, right? Like, again, I don't think...
What is the 1970s scenario?
The 1970s scenario is the world where progressives feel like they lost the country. They had the 60s and then Richard Nixon took power. And you get a spiral of weirdo radicalization, Weather Underground, Days of Rage, all these things. And suddenly you do actually have, left-wing terrorist movements in America. That was the last time we had what I would describe as sort of a consistently radicalized, violent left. And I don't think we have that right now, but I worry about it, and I worry more than I did 6 days ago because, honestly, so far what we know about the motives of Charlie Kirk's shooter suggests that he fits that category more than the kind of, unclassifiable, radicalized person. But am I just sort of, am I just a conservative worrying too much? Do you worry about that kind of radicalization on the left?
At the moment, I don't, to just be blunt. I don't think we're seeing the emergence of Weather Underground style things.
You're not, you're not seeing organized. I agree. But
I look at the violence of the past couple of years and I see, the person who broke into Nancy Pelosi's home.
All right, I'm going to jump ahead. This is part of the interview I thought was perhaps best.
Broader vista here, a vista of, abundance, if you will, right? And yeah, I completely agree with you that liberalism, progressivism, the Democrats have all of these sort of concrete kind of discourse-driven flaws, right? They're sort of failing at the discourse of the internet era. But you talked earlier about the big challenge that Democrats have had ever since Obamacare passed, right? Of figuring out what's next, right? What's the horizon? And I think that that's linked to what I see as pessimism, maybe you only see as uncertainty, disquiet, fear of Trump, for a movement that calls itself progressive, right? There's a lack of utopian ambition. And when I read your book, especially at the beginning, I was like, this is a utopian book. We're not going to talk about the specifics of zoning reform. I want you to say something utopian about the future that you think progressives should be.
I believe technology can dramatically transform human life for the better. Dramatically.
And this is where suddenly everything sort of begins to come apart because, and this is also where sort of the Charlie Kirk moment and the Tyler Robinson moment, because while people are trying to sort of locate him on this right-left thing, well, okay, but the predominant thing that comes out is internet derangement. That's overshadowing everything, is just internet derangement. And so when your utopian vision is that technology can improve everything, it's like, no wonder you're having a crisis of the future.
I think it can make possible ways of living. I think it can solve problems that we take as completely inevitable and totally for granted. I think that we should be able to deliver dramatic changes to public infrastructure quickly. I think we should be able to build things. And I think when the government promises you something, from high-speed rail to a subway extension to a national electric vehicle charger network, that thing should emerge. It should be gleaming. It should happen quickly. It should be like, oh my fucking God, the government did that. And I think that...
And again, in terms of this thesis about the two kinds of radical conservatives, it's belief in or disbelief in government. And Klein continues to hold that, well, that's in many ways the divide, and it's government and it's technology. And of course, this is how the Pacific War was won. It was, very, at the beginning of the war, they had the Zeros, they had the best pilots, but very quickly, new planes begin to come out, and very quickly, the American technological, military, and industrial dominant just steamrolls the Japanese.
That one of the central failures of progressivism is it has not admitted it did this, but it has lost faith in what the government itself can do. And has lost faith in it, in part because it does not let the government do those things anymore. It has wrapped it in regulation and procedure in ways it does not allow it to deliver in the way that our own government has in the past, that other countries' governments do right now. So the big, dramatic, ambitious thing I want to say is that the future does not need to be like the present. And for that, we need institutions capable of delivering and working with change rapidly.
So there's a conservative or libertarian critique of your argument that says, basically, you can't get what you want through the means that you want to use to get it, because whatever the government might be in a hypothetical past, in this world, it's too encrusted with interest groups and their competing demands, right? And so to have abundance, you need to be more of a libertarian. And yeah, you want the government to do some things, sure, but mostly it's about deregulation and unleashing, and that you have a sort of naive faith in government capacity in this age. I want to stipulate that argument and not let you address it, and ask you to address
a unfair way of running a podcast, man.
I mean, it's my rules, and
you get to be on that side of the table today.
Well, I think you would have reasonable answers to that. I want to acknowledge its existence while asking you, while trying to again get down to this philosophical level, which is that I have been around progressives and liberals my entire life, and I would never describe them primarily as the part of America that has great faith in technology's capacity to change human life for the better. Quite the reverse. Now, as you mentioned, some of the people who have...
And this was such an interesting point that he made, and it shows... So Michael Martin, who's going to be at Southeast Jewelry, is such an interesting point in this, because in some ways you'd expect Michael Martin to be a granola crunching, tie-dye, Waldorf teaching, back to the earth, aging hippie with his guitar in his hand. And he's anti-technology, of course. And on Twitter, he's not a lib. I'll just say that if you look at his Twitter feed. Not a lib. But you'd sort of expect him to be anti-war. And this is where, you see, the counterculture got so interesting, because the counterculture was supposed to, many of the waves that move through defy easy categorization. Because in some ways, let's say the counterculture and the Jesus movement that came through it was progressivist. It could be utopian. But, when the Jesus movement moves through, and of course the Jesus movement is usually because the chaos of the liberation so quickly yielded so much chaos that the people very quickly turned to much more conservative things. Let's say a biblicistic, Protestant Christianity, which is what the Jesus movement had. And so again, this is where this right-left divide really breaks down quickly.
Zero faith in technology's ability to change human life for the better are sort of crunchy granola anti-vaccine types who have migrated maybe into the Republican tent, right? So there is maybe a part of the left that is anti-tech that is now on the right and in a different political coalition. But even so, even allowing for that migration, my general impression of post-1970s progressivism is that it is organized around, first, a premise that the most important thing is always redistribution, and second, that it just thinks that, technology is making the world worse in many ways, right? I had Peter Thiel on the podcast, and he gave me his sort of familiar, if you know his work, line about how the hippies ruined.
And then you've got someone like Peter Thiel, who is very pro-transhumanist. We don't have our flying cars, but very much coded Republican. And again, that's why this right and left thing, it breaks down fairly easily.
Western civilization by destroying faith and progress. And that's an overstatement, but isn't there something there? Isn't there a powerful mindset on the left that just sort of recoils from your pro-technology spiel?
I think some do. I think that one, and I appreciate you drawing this out because it's part of the book that has gotten less attention in the tour. People are more sort of interested in why we didn't build high-speed rail than this. But very much an intention of the book for me, explicitly, is rebuilding a progressive politics of technology. Because I believe in it. Because, one, in some ways it had already happened. The book is in part mode.
And what's so interesting about technology is that underneath it are the assumptions that either through more power, which is leveraged through technology, or through a low-cost manipulation, we'll just do things a little bit different, that problems will be solved. Okay, fine. Problems will be solved. Now, Douthit's really going to lean into him with respect to this.
But I would love to do as long as you want to do on
separate episode.
But let me say that he goes on in that speech to say something else. He does make a series of points about citizenship and belonging. He says, well,
they're talking about J.D. Vance's speech.
What's the point of all this? He says, well, it's to build, to make America great, to create as our forefathers once did. And I read that and I thought, in the period of time in which America did become this world-spanning colossus, a lot of it did have to do with our ability to integrate people into our community, our ability to welcome in immigrants, at different rates and at different times, but quite a lot of them. Our ability.
Some of the biggest catalysts for American transformation were the wars, the Civil War, and then the First and especially the Second World War. It's in the Second World War that the American empire really gets going. America was powerful, it had potential, but in the Second World War, America plays a heavy role in the defeat of the Nazis and completely owns the defeat of the Japanese. And, again, part of what Jordan Hall was talking about in terms of the totalizing, America could sort of look past so many of its own divisions, but it was in the wake of these wars, especially, that the civil rights movement really gets going, because in the Civil War and then the First World War and the Second World War, African Americans said, if we have to shed our blood for you, we deserve an equal seat at the table. And in many ways, and if you look, again, there's this interesting sort of dual biography of Churchill and Gandhi. And don't forget that sort of nationalist India and African Americans were just sort of told to be put on hold till the Germans and the Japanese are beaten, and then you'll get your liberty. And, that was very much true. India, sent plenty of troops to fight in the East. And afterwards, it's like, okay, we helped you defeat the Japanese and the Germans. Now it's time to set us free. And part of what happens, of course, America had been very much an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial nation because it itself had been a colony. Now, of course, that was tested with the Spanish-American War and the adoption of the Philippines. But even before the war, the timetable had been set to release the Philippines in 1946. And, of course, the Second World War, with in many ways, the collapse of the old colonial powers. They could no longer continue to dominate their properties overseas. They were just simply too costly. Economics had changed, and in many ways, part of what happens in the Second World War is that the American way of maintaining empire, which is much more of a trade empire rather than a governing empire, really comes to the fore.
To expand our community far beyond what other countries were typically capable of doing. And it made me think about how poor we have been in the Democratic Party about actually making not just the moral argument for our approach to belonging, not just the policy oversight of our approach to belonging, where you actually do need an orderly border and for people to feel you're doing things in the national interest, but the actual argument for at least part of our approach to belonging, which is it makes America stronger, it makes it more innovative, it makes it more generative, it makes it more dynamic. And there as being a lot of opportunity in that. There being a tradition here that we can take hold of that is an exciting tradition, a tradition of dynamism, a tradition of change, a tradition of welcoming people in who then do amazing things they could do here that they could do nowhere else. So if you want my version of your cosmic hope, I do think that there's a story in which America doesn't just bend towards justice, but it does bend towards a kind of greatness that comes from a kind of diversity and inclusion, one might call it.
But diversity,
that has fallen out a bit of favor.
And this is the last demand I'll make of you. Inclusion into what exactly? What view? What vision of the good life? This is where I still feel like the utopianism of your book, while really good as a corrective to despair, lacks something that even the right in its various, sort of dark and black-pilled forms still gets to offer, right? Which is that, the right can say, you see Charlie Kirk say this over and over again, right? In one of the personas that he had was sort of, Christian evangelist and Christian dad, right? Where he would go around and say, look, to young men, he would say, look, politics is important, but you have to get married and you have to go to church and you have to start a family, right? That is a concrete vision of the good life that politics exists to support and technology exists to enrich, right? And in mid-century America, in mid-20th century America, it was connected to a thin but still real sort of Protestant-ish civic religion in which, human beings had an earthly destiny and a heavenly destiny too. And it is impossible for me as a religious person, I'm sorry, not to look at sort of progressivism right now and say, you need something else in the horizon besides saying we're going to be inclusive and we're going to get rich together with flying cars. You need to say so that we can live in some specific way that we are supposed to live. What is that way, Ezra Klein? How then shall we live?
My friend
Francis Schaeffer. Now, he doesn't have much of an answer. Now, I'm sure, as many of you know, Tucker Carlson had this big thing on after Charlie Kirk. And he had Megyn Kelly and Scott Adams and this one of the young Turks. I know nothing about this man. And this was the most interesting one to include in it. Because the first introduction that Tucker Carlson gives, I didn't watch the whole thing. I sort of skipped around. I was most interested in Scott Adams and Josiah Trenum. But I did start listening to it. And what I found so interesting about the introduction was Tucker Carlson basically gave that standard American civil religion Christian argument. That the basic standard American civil religion argument that's Protestant but not definite. It's basically, it's so interesting because he was basically giving the Cold War consensus Protestant Christian argument that Douthit just pointed to. Says, this is what we have to do. We have to do this again. We have to do this some more. And of course, there's a lot of hope that, and it's in that way that Kirk, again, was sort of a looking back to the post-war consensus. And Scott Adams, he said a couple of interesting things. It said more interesting things than I thought he would. And then I didn't listen to all of Josiah Trenum's, partly because he's an American who began as a conservative Presbyterian, but he has, in Dutch you have something, I believe, and I'm sure that the Hollanders will correct me, something that I grew up understanding as a preektoon. What does that mean? It's sort of a preacher speech that when you, it's sort of an accent mask or an accent vestment. And I've asked before, I said, if anybody has recordings of how he spoke, like before he became Orthodox, I'd love to hear it. Because what's so interesting about this is that it almost sounds like a foreign accent, because one would expect a foreign accent from an Orthodox. It would sort of be like if I decided that when I spoke as a minister, as I preached, I would have a Dutch brogue. If I grew up in a church where, let's say the Christian Reformed Church at the beginning of the 20th century, where almost all of the ministers were immigrants. And so it's almost like if he really wants to be an Orthodox minister, he should be an immigrant, and he should have, I don't know what version of Orthodoxy, he should have a Russian or a Ukrainian or a Romanian. He should have an Eastern European accent. But again, what's so interesting about this is that the evangelical project in the late 20th century was, in some ways, an attempt to replace the main line. And that attempt, for the most part, didn't really succeed. And now I almost see a renewal of that attempt. But there's, of course, playing around with other traditions of Christianity in which state churches, and again, the churches as institutions, that's how they expressed their authority and agency within the nation state. And I don't think we're going to see that revived. You know, again, I've been reading this biography of Tolstoy, and I read it with a lot of interest with respect to just the collapse of state churches. You see this in Eastern Europe beneath communism. And, you know, is Putin going to make Orthodoxy great again? I don't think so. He seems to be trying. Early 20th century, you had, again, you had all of these European monarchs And then you had the rise of fascism, and there was some of the hope that fascism would be able to, the Catholic Church could sort of ride fascist coattails, and sort of had that hope for Spain, which again, solidly Roman Catholic country, Italy, the heart of Catholicism. But of course, once Germany comes online and Hitler is persecuting priests, it's like, this isn't going to work. And then with the Allied victory, suddenly you see an inclusion of Catholicism and Americanism joined together. And it's not exactly the same as, let's say, the main line, but the Catholics and the evangelicals could work together, especially against abortion and other reproductive issues, in ways that would sort of lower the tent and in some ways make Catholicism into a denomination. The interesting thing about a move like this is the thing is that when churches as institutions get closer and closer to state power, I think, generally speaking, the churches as institutions suffer. Billy Graham, played that card towards the end of the 20th century, and he was the spiritual advisor of how many presidents. And towards the end, my impression was he sort of gave up that gig. And you saw a little bit of renewal of that when Rick Warren says a prayer at Obama's first inauguration, but then Giglio is disinvited in 2012 because of his conservative stance on human sexuality. And of course, Tucker has a little bit of cozying up to orthodoxy in the video where that my friend John Heers was on with the demon scratching Tucker Carlson. So I saw this and I thought, oh, this is just so interesting. Because on one hand, there is no unified Orthodox church in America. They're immigrant churches, most of them. There's an Orthodox Church of America, yeah, but the Orthodox, of course, will say, well, we work very slowly, maybe in a couple centuries. We're in liquid modernity and things are changing fastly. So, I'm just thinking if I'm going to include something in this or not, but it's a sensitive thing, so I don't want to include it. I want to be careful with it because it involves nobody at Living Stones. It involves people who are writing these things on their Substack or the internet, but maybe I will include it. Many of you know that I first got to know Cale Zeldin through his work with Steve Skojec, who, as a conservative Catholic, and then he left the faith. And now his marriage is breaking up. And of course, Rod Dreher, too, has been very open on his Substack about his marriage breaking up. And in this age of social media, Jen Hatmaker just had hers. Was writing about her divorce and came out with a new book talking about it. And this question about young people and institutions and the left conservative radicals and the right conservative radicals, and marriage for many of them is the test. Now, of course, Steve left the faith, and I just want to say this is just so incredibly sad. And I'm not pointing finger. There have been times in my marriage where I didn't know if I was going to make it, and could still not make it. I understand that. And but the conservative promise is that, well, the fall of the institutions will stop, and that we can actually stabilize ourselves. And of course, some will say, well, it's because he left the faith. Well, I don't know. Anyone finally who's going to have credibility in our culture, they're going to have to, Jordan Hall said it a number of times. I mean, integrity, without integrity, you're just not going to have it. And integrity is so hard to have when you're living in a panopticon, especially a social media panopticon. Anyway, the Douthit Klein video was a banger. Definitely watch the whole thing. Leave a comment.